When I first started this project, I had absolutely no intention of making it into full diorama. It sort of all just came together in its own. Greytide Studios gave me free access to all of their files, and I just ended up printing all of them, and I had no idea what I should use them for, until I found this awesome looking base and had the idea for the diorama. And the diorama will feature this awesome looking Poxwalker zombie, as well as a Space Marine Crusader. When I first printed out all these bits, my original intention was to make this really awesome looking Black Templar. However, with so many choices, ironically, I couldn't decide on one simple thing I wanted to build. But as I began to put all the different parts onto the model, I started having the idea for what the story could be. These heads were the original pieces I was most excited for. Even though it's a very small and relatively simple piece, I really wanted to go for the battle monk aesthetic. I tried sculpting something similar with green stuff in the past, however, I could just never get it right. However, what did look right was a pauldron with a holy book on it, because that fits the monk aesthetic perfectly. And with the second pauldron, I accidentally glued my finger to it because unfortunately they don't make super glue idiot proof yet. Next up, I pulled out the Crusader sprue and wanted to see if I can find anything else on it. And I realized that I almost once again made the mistake of not including a bunch of purity seals on a Black Templar. I know some of these bits don't look like they belong on a Black Templar, however, I just decided to ignore that and just pick stuff that looked really cool. To compensate for this horrible act of heresy, I did decide to attach some purity seals to all of the weapons. Originally, my intention was to actually order some jewelry chains and then use that to wrap it around the weapons. However, what ended up arriving was actually an enormous chain that would be far too big for this miniature. But for now, I knew that this Templar was missing something to make him even more awesome, and that's gonna be a cape. I was surprised that I actually did not need to reattach the backpack and I could just simply slide it in. I was quite relieved as I really did not want to force off the power pack. Speaking of the power pack, I got some really awesome looking accessories that I can put on top of it. I sat there looking at 3 of my favorite options for quite some time until I ultimately settled for the Iron Halo, as I thought it would be very cool to give this guy some extra protection. Personally, I think it's one of the coolest and most underrated piece of the Astartes equipment, as it's a very powerful personal conversion field. Next, I wanted to attach these cool purity seals to his collar. However, it just looked a little bit strange, so instead I decided to attach it to the tacet. And as I like seeing tacets on every single Space Marine, and the word tacet is definitely not something I just learned, I will say tacets a few more times just to really get the effect of the tacets into it. And with my typical clumsiness, I ended up dropping the miniature. However, when dealing with 3D prints, my thought was instantly that something must have broken now, so I have to repair the entire thing. However, I printed these using something called ABS, and this stuff is unreasonably strong, so I no longer have to worry about accidentally breaking my prints. Also, I just accidentally made an amazing looking belt buckle. The only problem now is I have to be really careful around some of these prints as they look sharp and they are sharp as a result. But with this Black Templar attached, it's time to get him painted. Now there's a bit of a problem. Unfortunately, all my Poxwalkers I glued to their base with plastic cement, which essentially binds them in a permanent bond. Previously, I would have spent hours scratching my way under his leg like some sort of a rat. However, I had a better idea. I used some of the plastic glue underneath the leg, and with that, it essentially reactivated the plastic, easily sliding off the base without any issues. And with that, I got to the priming stage of the process. For the base and the Crusader, I decided to go with black, and then for the Poxwalker, I actually used some of the white primer instead. Now in hindsight, I think I probably should have chosen slightly bigger base as the Space Marine is just hulking over this poor little Poxwalker, but it'll still look really awesome on my desk. And for the Poxwalker, I decided to use these contrast paints as I don't get to use them too often and it's just a really fun way to paint. Even though this style of painting is often looked down on, I think it's a fantastic way to paint your miniatures and it's also a ton of fun. And when it comes to very organic looking miniatures similar to Poxwalkers, I think it's a really cool way to create very smooth blends that otherwise would have taken you hours. I applied some of the very original Plague Bear flesh to him, and then used some of the Gilliman flesh to create the idea that there's still some sort of a human underneath this crazy mutation. As I was painting this Poxwalker, this is when the idea to turn this whole diorama into the Grimdark aesthetic started to come into fruition. I began applying more and more different gore elements to him, as well as some of these very awful looking bruising areas. Then using some red paint on his arm to depict that something horrible has recently happened, including doing an additional streak coming off his mouth where his hand is located. I also repainted his jacket in the Astra Militarum colors, perhaps hinting as to his background before he became an awful looking Poxwalker. But for now, it's time to pull out the magic of streaking grime. When it comes to Death Guard especially, I think this stuff is just magic in a bottle. It provides a very interesting aesthetic for them, not to mention gives it a lot more depth that you otherwise would have a hard time achieving. And with the miniature prepped and ready, I grabbed some of this odorless thinner and got to removing it. It's been a while since I used some streaking grime, so I only used the Q-tip and I entirely forgot to use the sponge to remove the fibers from the Q-tip, so it is what it is. Due to this mistake, unfortunately, some of the transitions weren't as smooth as I wanted them to be. While the Q-tip is amazing at removing the grime, the sponge has an additional effect where sometimes it drags the grime along from the deeper areas. And with this relatively quick step, this Poxwalker had a lot of additional depth to him. For now, it was time to move on to the base. I picked out a relatively neutral gray color and just dry brushed it onto it. This will have an additional effect of some of the natural shadows that the texture itself will create. Then I took some of the previous contrast paints I was using and began creating this gruesome battlefield. I did not wait for the paint to dry as I wanted this essentially mud and blood to mix together in this awful mixture, with some additional bile to symbolize the presence of Nurgle. And for the next trick, I'll need a moment of silence. Nailed it. Then, with some additional pure red, I also created some additional highlights just to draw the visual attention towards that point. And with the Poxwalker attached to the base, it was looking really awesome. However, it was still missing something, so I wanted to use some special stuff. Now, this stuff is essentially just a glossy varnish, however, it does have a slightly of a sepia tint to it. It works really well, and especially when applying to a Poxwalker, it'll create this idea of this very disgusting pus that is just leaking out from all over him. When the streaking grime dried, it left the miniature looking very matte. As a result, some of the colors were looking very dull. This will shift the colors back closer to what I originally intended for the miniature. There will also be an additional interesting effect of a contrast between texture of the Poxwalker and the Black Templar. As this wet effect began to dry, I also created a little bit of a texture, which should provide an additional atmosphere to the overall theme. For the Black Templar, I considered painting him in a similar style to what I did for my Stormcast Black Templar. However, I realized that it would look slightly out of place considering that the style I took for the Poxwalker as well as the base itself. So instead, I decided to go for a slightly different and much simpler style, but something that will not look out of place on the rest of the diorama. For majority of the color scheme, I decided to go for the idea that combines black, red, and gold, which generally just looks really badass. For the power gauntlet, I decided to not ignore those gems and give them this very interesting emerald color, which contrasted really well against the miniature. As this cloak was detachable, it was such a joy to paint. All I literally had to do was just take it off, do some airbrushing, and then just slap it back on. I considered gluing it, but it was holding so well that I just decided to keep it detachable. I also tried my best to give him some additional eyeballs underneath the mask, but those turned out a little bit wonky. I also provided some additional highlights to all of my reds as I felt like they could use some pop. For the most precious step in the process, it's time to attach some gold onto this model. For some reason, I decided to experiment and add some flow improver onto my gold, and that was a little bit of a mistake. The coverage was absolutely incredible, however, I had some difficulties controlling it, especially when it came to some of these much more trickier areas. And for the massive power mace, I just used some gunmetal gray. Now for the Black Templar, I decided to go for this red streaking grime. The idea behind that is I think it's a perfect color to symbolize the fact that he's covered in a mixture of this horrible mud and blood mixed together. This Templar has been battling this planet for days, and heretics cover him head to toe. Now all that was left to do is just remove the streaking grime and see the final result.